Shadow on the ceiling. It started with a sound, just a faint, irregular tapping, like the nervous twitch of fingers against glass. Nothing remarkable at first, the kind of noise you blame on an old house settling into its own bones or the wind threading through unseen cracks. But the house wasn't old. It was new, sterile even, all sharp angles and polished surfaces, the drywall still smelling faintly of paint. And yet, every night, just after the house exhaled into silence, the tapping began. At first, I thought it was the pipes. Then maybe the neighbors. But the sounds didn't follow any logic, no rhythm, no pattern, just random bursts of soft knocks that seemed to ripple through the walls themselves. I tried to ignore it, stuffing my ears with headphones, drowning it under podcasts and white noise, but it was like the sound wormed its way under everything, persistent, patient. But the sound wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the shadow. The first night I saw it, I'd woken up suddenly, not from a dream but from a suffocating stillness, like the air had turned solid in my lungs. I stared at the ceiling, blinking into the dark, and there it was, a faint smudge, darker than the room, clinging to the plaster above my bed. At first, I thought it was just the trick of streetlights leaking through the blinds, casting odd shapes. But it didn't flicker or shift like shadows should. It held its form, vaguely humanoid, yet wrong. Too long. Too thin. Like someone stretched it until it almost snapped. I froze, convincing myself I was still half asleep, but then it moved. It didn't slide like a shadow should. It crept. Slowly. Purposefully. It inched closer to where I lay, its outline sharpening with every breath I took, as if feeding on my fear. I snapped on the bedside lamp, heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear if the tapping had returned. The ceiling was blank, just plain white, smooth and empty. The next morning, I blamed it on sleep paralysis, even though I knew that wasn't right. I'd been able to move, to sit up, to scramble for the light. But rationalizing felt safer. Safer than admitting that something was wrong with my house. But it didn't stop. Every night, the shadow came back, always starting in the same spot, always a little clearer, a little bolder. I tried everything, sleeping with the lights on, rearranging the furniture, even staying at a friend's place. But the shadow wasn't tied to the room. It was tied to me. The night I realized that was the night I saw it move even with the lights on. I'd fallen asleep with the lamp blazing, convinced that light would keep it at bay. But sometime past midnight, I jolted awake to that suffocating pressure again, like the air was folding in on itself. The bulb still glared, casting sterile yellow across the room, but there it was etched onto the ceiling like a stain that refused to be scrubbed out. And it was closer. Much closer. Its edges sharp enough to trace, no longer vague or shifting. That's when the fear really sank in, not the jump scare kind of fear, but the deep, marrow-level dread that gnaws at your sanity. Because now I knew, the shadow wasn't just there. It was getting closer. And it wasn't leaving. I started noticing other things after that. Small details that seemed insignificant until they weren't. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like something trying to escape from within the walls. My reflection in the bathroom mirror felt delayed, just for a second, like it had to catch up. Objects weren't where I left them, keys on the counter, a mug slightly turned, a chair out of place. I even recorded myself sleeping, thinking maybe I'd catch something, anything that could explain it. The footage was worse than nothing. Hours of me lying still, eyes fluttering under closed lids, while that shadow on the ceiling slowly drifted closer, frame by frame. And then, at some point in the footage, I'd be staring directly at the camera, eyes wide open, unblinking. I had no memory of it. None. I tried showing the video to a friend, but it glitched, static bursts, distorted audio, and then nothing. Just a black screen. They laughed it off, said I was overworked, stressed, maybe needed to get out more. Maybe they were right. But deep down, I knew better. The shadow was real. And it was hungry. I became obsessed, tracking its movements, marking how much closer it got each night. It was like a countdown, though I didn't know to what. I didn't want to know. But curiosity is a cruel thing. It digs into you, festers, whispers that maybe knowing is better than fearing the unknown. So, one night, I decided to confront it. I lay in bed, lights off, staring at the ceiling, waiting. The shadow appeared right on schedule, darker, clearer than ever. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay still, to watch. It moved, inching closer, slow and deliberate. My breathing grew ragged, but I didn't flinch. And then, it stopped. Right above me. I couldn't move. Not because of fear, but because something was holding me down, an invisible weight pressing into my chest, pinning me to the mattress. I felt the air grow colder, the room shrinking around me. The shadow stretched, elongated, and for the first time, I saw its face. Or rather, the absence of one. Just hollow darkness where features should be, an endless void staring back at me. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up the next morning on the floor, my throat raw like I'd been screaming, though I didn't recall any sound. The ceiling was blank again. But the shadow had left something behind, finger-shaped bruises around my wrists, dark and precise. I didn't sleep after that. Not for days. But exhaustion is its own kind of prison. Eventually, I passed out, despite everything. And when I woke up, the shadow wasn't on the ceiling anymore. It was beside me. The next night, I tried not to look. I told myself it was nothing, just shadows from the streetlight outside filtering through the blinds, maybe even my overworked mind conjuring things out of exhaustion. But denial has its limits. When something unnatural presses itself against the thin fabric of your reality, pretending it isn't there is like trying to ignore a splinter buried deep in your skin. It festers, it grows, it demands attention. I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, pretending to scroll through my phone though my eyes weren't reading anything. The room felt heavier than usual, as if the air had gained weight, pressing down on my chest. The faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen seemed unnervingly loud, a sharp contrast to the otherwise oppressive silence. I could feel it before I saw it, a shift, an almost imperceptible darkening of the already dim ceiling. I looked up. There it was again. The shadow. But this time, it was clearer. No longer just an indistinct blur. It had definition, jagged edges like fingers stretching out, grasping for something. It wasn't stationary. It moved, not fast, but with purpose, inching closer to the spot directly above my bed. My pulse throbbed in my ears, loud enough to drown out the rational voice screaming that shadows don't move on their own. I couldn't tear my eyes away, hypnotized by the slow, deliberate crawl of darkness. The worst part wasn't just seeing it. It was feeling it. A coldness that wasn't tied to temperature, more like an absence of warmth, as if the air itself was being drained of life. My breath came out in shallow, ragged gasps, my body refusing to cooperate, pinned by an invisible weight. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't dreaming. I was awake, paralyzed by fear and something else, something ancient, something wrong. Eventually, the shadow retreated, melting back into the ceiling's mundane cracks and stains as if it had never been there. But I knew better. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Morning light offered no comfort. The shadow wasn't bound to darkness, it had etched itself into the fabric of my mind, a permanent stain on my sanity. I thought about leaving. Packing a bag and getting out, finding a hotel or crashing on a friend's couch. But fear does strange things, it roots you in place, convincing you that running won't save you, that the thing you're trying to escape is already inside you, stitched into your reality. So, I stayed. Days passed, each night a repetition of the same dread. The shadow grew bolder, its movements more fluid, less like a trick of light and more like a sentient being learning, adapting. I started noticing small changes around the apartment, scratches on the walls where there had been none before, faint whispers that dissolved the moment I strained to hear them, cold spots that lingered even under the harsh glare of daylight. I stopped inviting people over. It wasn't just embarrassment. I was afraid of what they might see, or worse, what they wouldn't. There's a unique kind of terror in experiencing something no one else can validate, a creeping doubt that eats away at the edges of your reality. One night, driven by equal parts fear and curiosity, I set up my phone to record. I positioned it on the dresser, lens pointed toward the ceiling, hit record, and climbed into bed. Sleep came in fits, if at all. The shadow returned, more vivid than ever, stretching long, spindly limbs that seemed to twitch with anticipation. I didn't move. I couldn't. Morning arrived like an afterthought, gray and indifferent. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone, my heart a metronome of dread. I pressed play. For the first few minutes, nothing. Just the static hum of a restless night. Then, movement, a subtle shift in the ceiling's texture, a ripple of darkness blooming like spilled ink. The shadow. But it wasn't just on the ceiling. It was more than that. As I watched, frozen with horror, the shadow seemed to detach from the flatness of the surface, dipping down slightly, as if testing the limits of its confinement. Its shape was wrong, impossible angles, a silhouette that didn't belong to anything recognizable. And then, it turned. No face, just a void where a face should be, yet somehow, I knew it was looking directly at the camera, at me. The screen flickered, distorted for a heartbeat, then returned to static normalcy as if nothing had happened. But it had. I saw it. I deleted the video. Not out of disbelief, but because keeping it felt like inviting something permanent into my life, a digital echo of a nightmare that was already too real. After that night, the shadow grew restless. It didn't wait for darkness anymore. I'd catch glimpses of it in broad daylight, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a smudge of movement where there should be none. My apartment wasn't a home anymore, it was a cage, and I was both prisoner and warden, too afraid to leave, too terrified to stay. And the worst part? The shadow was getting closer. I stopped counting the nights, because time had lost its grip on me. Days bled into each other, stitched together by the same thread of dread that tightened around my throat every time the sun dipped below the horizon. The apartment felt smaller, the walls pressing in with invisible hands. Even the furniture seemed complicit, casting strange reflections in the windows, twisting into shapes that didn't match the reality I remembered. I rarely left, except when I absolutely had to, groceries, the occasional obligatory meeting with people who still thought I was functional. But every time I stepped outside, the shadow followed me, not physically, but like a residue smeared across my perception. Crowded streets didn't drown it out. Bright lights didn't erase it. It lingered in reflections, shop windows, puddles after rain, even the sheen of my own eyes staring back from a bathroom mirror. One evening, I thought about burning the place down. The idea flared up suddenly, sharp and seductive. Fire could cleanse, right? Reduce everything to ash, including whatever was tethered to this cursed ceiling. But as soon as the thought settled, an oppressive cold swept through the room, as if the very idea had angered it. The lights flickered, not the playful stutter of faulty wiring, but a deliberate pulse, on, off, on, like a heartbeat, or a warning. I didn't light the match. Sleep became impossible. I drifted in and out of restless trances, haunted by dreams that weren't dreams, visions of the shadow crawling not just on the ceiling but through the very fabric of my existence, threading itself into my veins. I woke up with bruises I couldn't explain, faint hand-shaped impressions around my ankles, my wrists. The shadow was no longer content to be a passive observer. It wanted something. I started hearing it, not just the faint whispers, but clear, distinct sounds, scratching, like nails dragged slowly across drywall. Sometimes it was above me, other times, impossibly, from within the walls themselves. And then there were the footsteps, soft at first, hesitant, like it was learning how to mimic the living. They grew bolder with each passing night, pacing just beyond the door, stopping abruptly, as if listening. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I shouted at it. Words don't matter when you're that far gone, they spill out like bile, raw and meaningless. I cursed, I pleaded, I screamed until my throat was raw. The shadow didn't flinch. Instead, it moved faster, slithering across the ceiling with a fluid, predatory grace, stopping directly above me. It stayed there, motionless, a dark stain against the cracked white plaster, as if mocking my outburst. That was when I realized it wasn't just following me, it was feeding off me. My fear, my isolation, my unraveling sanity. It wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. Ghosts are echoes of the past. This thing was something else entirely, something ancient and hungry. I tried to leave. Packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and ran. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, a crushing wave of nausea hit me, my vision blurring, the world tilting at impossible angles. My knees buckled, and I found myself sprawled on the floor, gasping for air that felt too thick, too heavy. I crawled back inside, and the sickness lifted immediately, replaced by a familiar coldness that now felt almost welcoming. Like coming home. It had me. I stopped fighting after that. Let myself slip into the routine of coexisting with it, pretending it wasn't there even as it crept closer each night. The shadow grew bolder, sometimes dipping low enough that I could feel a faint chill against my skin, like a breath from something that shouldn't breathe. I wondered if it would ever fully reach me, what would happen if it did. Eventually, it did. I don't remember the exact night. They all blurred together by then. But I remember waking up, paralyzed, not the sleep paralysis kind, but a different, deeper stillness. My eyes refused to move, but I could feel it, hovering just inches above me. A darkness so dense it felt solid, pressing down, filling the spaces where air should be. Then, it entered me. Not like possession. Possession implies control, a battle of wills. This was assimilation. I felt it seep into my skin, cold tendrils wrapping around my bones, threading through my thoughts until I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. Now, I sit here, writing this, not as a warning, because warnings imply hope, a chance to escape. There's no escape. If you're reading this, it means I've already gone, or maybe I never existed the way you think I did. Check your ceiling. But don't look too long.